There's a bird outside your window right now that has already decided what it thinks of you. It does not know your name, but it has a file on you anyway, built from the way you walk, the car you drive, whether you have ever thrown a rock in its direction. And for the first time in history, scientists have started feeding the sounds this bird makes into artificial intelligence, hoping to find out exactly what it has been saying about us this whole time. What they are finding is not science fiction. It is stranger than that, because it is real, it is happening right now, and it is forcing researchers to rewrite some very old assumptions about what counts as language, who gets to have one, and how long crows have been talking about humans behind our backs. For most of the 20th century, the scientific consensus on bird intelligence was blunt and mostly dismissive. Birds were considered simple creatures, running on instinct, capable of little beyond basic survival behavior. The insult bird brain existed for a reason. It reflected genuine scientific belief built on the anatomy of the bird brain itself. Mammals, including humans, processed a complex thought using the cerebral cortex, the layered, wrinkled outer surface of the brain that handles reasoning, planning, and problem solving. Birds do not have a cerebral cortex. Their brains are smooth, compact, and structured completely differently. For decades, that absence was treated as proof that birds simply lacked the hardware for anything resembling complex cognition. That assumption turned out to be one of the more significant mistakes in modern neuroscience. Birds did not fail to evolve a cortex. They evolved something else entirely, a structure called the pallium, and within it, regions like the nidopallium caudolateral, which functions in ways strikingly similar to the mammalian prefrontal cortex, despite having a completely different evolutionary origin and cellular architecture. Nature arrived at two different engineering solutions to the same problem, complex thought, using two different blueprints. Once researchers understood this, the old assumption collapsed. Pound for pound, a crow's brain is remarkably dense with neurons, and studies comparing brain-to-body ratios and neuron packing have placed corvids, the family that includes crows, ravens, magpies, and jays, in the same conversation as great apes when it comes to raw cognitive capacity. Researchers have taken to calling them feathered apes, and the comparison is not just a catchy phrase. It reflects a growing body of evidence about what these birds can actually do. The clearest and most famous demonstration of that intelligence came from the work of Dr. John Marsloff and his colleagues at the University of Washington in a series of experiments that have become some of the most cited findings in behavioral ecology. Marsloff wanted to know whether wild crows could recognize individual human faces, remember them, and pass that recognition on to others. To test this without permanently marking any one researcher as an enemy for life, his team wore a distinctive mask while trapping, banding, and releasing crows on campus. The birds did not enjoy the experience. They scolded and struggled exactly as you would expect from an animal that has just been captured by a stranger. Then the mask came off, the team returned to their normal faces, and life on campus went back to normal, at least from a human perspective. From the crow's perspective, nothing had gone back to normal at all. Every time a researcher put the mask back on, even years later, crows in the area would immediately start mobbing and scolding, diving at the mask wearer, regardless of who was actually underneath it. That alone would be an impressive display of memory. What matter? Yet the finding genuinely remarkable is what happened over time. Crows that had never been captured, never encountered the mask directly, began attacking it too. Young crows, hatched well after the original experiment ended, learned to treat the mask as a threat despite having no personal history with it at all. Marsloff's team documented this. Recognition persisting for more than a decade after the original trapping. The information had spread through the local crow population socially, from bird to bird, parent to offspring, neighbor to neighbor, in what researchers describe as a form of cultural transmission, the same basic mechanism by which human communities pass down knowledge that no single living member personally experienced firsthand. Brain imaging work that followed helped explain how this kind of recognition actually feels from the inside, at least in terms of what is measurably happening in the crow's neural circuitry. When crows are shown an image of a face they associate with a past threat, researchers have recorded activation across several interconnected brain regions, including areas functionally comparable to the amygdala, the structure in the mammalian brain most closely tied to processing fear. This suggests that recognizing a dangerous human face is not simply a matter of the crow W, retrieving a stored visual pattern the way a computer might match an image to a database entry. It appears to be an integrated experience, blending memory, visual identification, and an emotional threat. Response into a single reaction, built on brain architecture that, again, evolved independently from our own but converges on a similar functional outcome. None of this exists in isolation. Crows and their corvid relatives have spent decades racking up a body of research that keeps pushing the boundary of what scientists thought was possible outside the primate order. New Caledonian crows manufacture and use tools in the wild, shaping twigs and leaves into hooks to extract insect larvae from crevices. And they do this with a level of standardization across individuals that hints at learned technique rather than pure trial and error. In laboratory settings, crows have solved multi-step problems modeled on Aesop's fable about a thirsty crow dropping stones into a pitcher to raise the water level, correctly judging which materials would sink, which would float, and how much displacement would actually bring water within reach. Ravens have demonstrated the ability to plan for future events they have never directly experienced, selecting and saving tools for a task they will only be able to perform later, a level of forward planning that was once considered exclusive to humans and a small handful of great apes. None of these findings on their own prove that crows have language in the way linguists define it. But together, they establish something scientists no longer seriously dispute, that corvid cognition is flexible, social, and far more sophisticated than the smooth, cortex-free anatomy of their brains would ever suggest at first glance. Some of the most striking corvid experiments involve self-control and delayed gratification, the kind of tests originally designed for young children and primates. Ravens and crows have been shown to hold onto a less preferable item. If trading it in later will earn them something better, resisting the pull of an immediate reward in favor of a delayed payoff, a capacity that requires the animal to hold a mental model of a future exchange that has not happened yet. Corvids have also passed mirror-based self-recognition tests in some experimental setups, and studies on magpies, close relatives of crows, have produced results consistent with an animal that can distinguish a mark on its own body, reflected in a mirror from a mark on another bird, a benchmark long treated as a proxy for a basic sense of self-awareness. Taken individually, any one of these findings might be explained away as a narrow, task-specific skill. Taken together across dozens of independent research groups working with different corvid species over several decades, they paint a consistent picture of an animal family that keeps clearing cognitive bars. Nobody expected a bird to clear, using a brain that took a completely separate evolutionary road to get there. This is the context that makes the newest chapter of crow research so significant, and it starts with a very unglamorous problem: too much data. In northern Spain, researchers Vittorio Baglione and Daniela Canestrari, both at the University of Leon, have spent decades studying a population of carrion crows with an unusual social structure. Unlike most crows, which breed in isolated pairs, these carrion crows are cooperative breeders. Entire extended family groups take part in raising chicks, feeding them, defending the nest, and coordinating tasks across multiple adult birds rather than just two parents. That kind of cooperation requires communication, a lot of it, and the two researchers wanted to understand exactly how these family groups were coordinating their behavior. To find out, they turned to biologging technology, tiny devices attached to individual crows that combine a microphone with a motion sensor, recording both what a bird says and what it does, moment by moment, throughout its day. Each recorder could capture roughly 6 or 7 days of continuous audio before it needed to be retrieved and replaced. Multiply that across an entire family group over multiple breeding seasons, and the result was an audio archive of well over 150,000 individual vocalizations, the overwhelming majority of them soft, low-volume calls that never register in casual observation, and had gone largely unanalyzed in prior decades of field research simply because no research team had the tools to process a dataset that size. That is where the Earth Species Project entered the picture. Earth Species Project is a nonprofit research organization founded in 2017 with a specific and ambitious mission to build artificial intelligence tools capable of helping scientists analyze and eventually understand animal communication across many different species, not just crows. Beginning in 2024, the organization partnered with Baglioni and Canestrari to apply machine learning models, including a tool called Voxaboxen, to the carrion crow dataset. The AI's initial job was not to translate anything, it was to do something more foundational, sort through the enormous volume of recordings and identify which sounds were acoustically distinct from one another, clustering similar calls together the way a search engine might group similar images, so that researchers could finally see patterns that had been buried in noise and volume for years. What the AI-assisted analysis has surfaced so far is genuinely exciting to the researchers involved, and it is worth being precise about what that means, because precision here matters more than drama. After 25 years of studying these birds, Baglioni and Canestrari say the models are revealing subtle acoustic distinctions between calls that field. Researchers, relying on the human ear alone, had never been able to separate before. The team is actively investigating whether specific vocal patterns correspond to specific cooperative tasks, whether a crow might, for instance, signal to its relatives who is going to take the next turn feeding the chicks. That question remains open. It has not been definitively answered, and the researchers themselves describe this work as being in an early exploratory stage rather than a finished discovery. This work is also directly tied to conservation, which is part of why the funding behind it has grown so quickly. Earth Species Project has drawn significant financial backing from tech philanthropists, including a multi-million-dollar grant announced in 2024 on the premise that better tools for decoding animal communication could translate into better tools for protecting endangered species, from monitoring beluga whale populations threatened by shipping noise to helping conservationists understand whether captive bred birds have retained the vocal knowledge they will need to survive after release. The crow research fits into that same mission, framed less as a quest to talk to animals and more as an attempt to finally understand, in enough acoustic detail, how a highly social species coordinates complex group behavior, information that has direct value for anyone trying to protect these birds or the ecosystems they are part of. This is a useful moment to be honest about the difference between what has actually been established and what is still being tested, because the story of AI and animal communication has attracted its share of exaggeration in recent years, and crows deserve better than hype. No published, peer-reviewed study has yet demonstrated that crows possess true grammatical syntax in the linguistic sense, and no research team has published evidence that crows assign unique, name-like vocal identifiers to specific individual humans the way some other species appear to. That second claim might sound familiar, and it should, because it has been documented elsewhere, just not yet in crows. Researchers using AI to analyze elephant rumbles found strong evidence that African savanna elephants address specific individuals with distinct, name-like vocalizations, a finding confirmed through playback experiments in which elephants responded more strongly to calls originally directed at them than to calls meant for others. Similarly, decades of research on bottlenose dolphins has established that they develop individually distinctive signature whistles that function much like names, allowing dolphins to identify and call out to specific companions across distance. These findings are real, they are published, and they show that name-like referential communication has independently evolved in more than one highly social, large-brained species. Crow research is heading in a similar direction, actively investigating whether something comparable exists in corvid vocalizations, but as of now, that specific piece of the puzzle remains a hypothesis being tested rather than a confirmed result. What has been documented repeatedly and rigorously is the broader behavioral evidence that crows track, remember, and communicate detailed social information about specific humans over long periods of time, which is exactly what Marslife's mask experiments demonstrated using observational methods decades before AI models entered the picture. The AI research happening now is best understood as an attempt to find the actual acoustic mechanism underneath behavior that biologists already know exists. Scientists have long observed that crows treat individual humans differently based on past experience, mobbing people they perceive as threats while showing far less concern toward people who have never bothered them. What nobody has been able to do until very recently is systematically catalog the specific sounds involved in that differential treatment at a scale large enough to draw statistically confident conclusions. That is the gap the Earth Species Project's tools are trying to close, and it is a meaningful, technically difficult problem even without invoking the word translation. There is also a well-documented behavior in crows that gives some of the clearest evidence yet that these birds process information about death, danger, and cause in a structured way, and it long predates any AI involvement. When a crow encounters a dead member of its own species, it frequently produces a distinct alarm call that draws other crows to the location. What follows is not scavenging or aggression. The gathered birds circle, watch and vocalize, sometimes for extended periods without touching the body. Researchers, including teams working with Marsliff, have documented that crows involved in these gatherings subsequently alter their behavior around the specific location and circumstances associated with the death, avoiding areas or individuals linked to the event in ways consistent with having drawn a cause and effect conclusion from what they observed. Some researchers describe these gatherings functionally as investigations, moments where the flock appears to be assessing risk collectively and encoding a warning that other birds carry forward. This behavior has been documented across multiple crow populations using standard field observation, and it stands as one of the strongest existing pieces of evidence that corvid social learning extends well beyond simple reflexive alarm calling into something closer to shared, updatable risk assessment. Corvid researchers have also documented genuine regional and population-level differences in vocal repertoires, sometimes called dialects, where calls used by one population differ measurably from calls used by another population of the same species living some distance away. This has been studied both in wild carrion crows and separately in Hawaiian crows, a critically endangered species that went extinct in the wild in 2002 and now survives only through captive breeding and reintroduction programs. In that specific case, Researchers working with the Earth Species Project have been comparing historical recordings of wild Hawaiian crow vocalizations against the calls used by today's captive-bred population, trying to determine whether decades of captivity have caused these birds to lose parts of their natural vocal repertoire, a question with direct, practical consequences for whether reintroduced birds will be able to communicate effectively once released back into native habitat. This is a case where AI-assisted bioacoustic analysis is not chasing a headline. It is doing conservation work, comparing large historical and modern data sets at a scale no individual researcher could manage by ear alone, in service of a species literally trying to survive. Stepping back from the details of any single study, the broader scientific project underway here, sometimes referred to as computational bioacoustics or animal language processing, is genuinely new, and it is expanding fast. Researchers across multiple institutions are applying similar machine learning approaches, models originally built to process human speech and repurposed to detect structure in animal sound, to species ranging from sperm whales and beluga whales to zebra finches and multiple crow species. The underlying premise is not that animals have a hidden human-like language waiting to be unlocked. It is that many highly social species appear to encode more structured, referential, and individually specific information in their vocalizations than earlier generations of researchers had the tools to detect, and that finding out how much structure is actually there, rather than assuming the answer in advance, requires processing power and pattern recognition that only became practical with recent advances in machine learning. The technical challenge underneath all of this is bigger than it might sound from the outside. Wild audio is messy. A single day of recordings from one biologger contains wind noise, traffic, overlapping calls from multiple crows at once, other bird species in the background, and long stretches of silence, all mixed together in one continuous stream. Before any model can even begin looking for patterns of meaning, it first has to solve what researchers call the cocktail party problem, the same challenge a human faces trying to follow one conversation in a crowded, noisy room, isolating a single speaker from a wall of overlapping sound. Earth Species Project engineers spent years building neural networks specifically to separate overlapping animal vocalizations into individual tracks and strip out background noise, releasing some of that code publicly so other research groups studying other species could build on it rather than starting from scratch. Only once individual calls can be reliably isolated does the harder work begin, clustering those calls by acoustic similarity, cross-referencing them against what the tagged bird was physically doing at that exact moment, thanks to the motion sensor riding alongside the microphone, and only then starting to ask whether a particular pattern of sound reliably predicts a particular behavior. It is slow, unglamorous, deeply technical work, and it is the actual foundation underneath any future claim about what crows are or are not saying to each other. It is also worth understanding a little about how linguists themselves define language, because that definition is the real bar this research is being measured against, whether or not a given headline says so. Linguists generally look for a specific cluster of features when deciding whether a communication system deserves to be called a language rather than a simple signaling system, things like arbitrariness, where a sound is not a direct physical imitation of what it represents. Productivity, the ability to combine a limited set of sounds into a potentially unlimited number of new meaningful combinations, and displacement, the ability to communicate about things that are not physically present, including past events and future possibilities. Alarm calls, that mean predator approaching, food source located, or come here now, the kind of signal scientists have documented in many bird species for a long time, generally satisfy few, if any, of these criteria. They function more like reflexive alerts than sentences. The open question driving the current wave of AI-assisted research is whether some corvid vocalizations, particularly the extended layered call sequences produced during long periods when no immediate threat or food source is present, show statistical evidence of productivity or displacement, evidence that would put them meaningfully closer to language on that scale, rather than simply being a larger inventory of the same kind of reflexive alerts already well documented in the literature. That evidence, if it exists, has not yet been published in peer-reviewed form. Finding it, or ruling it out, is precisely what the current generation of AI models is being built to test. That distinction matters because it is easy to slide from real, careful science into something closer to a campfire story, and crows, more than almost any other animal, invite that kind of storytelling. They are common, watchful, unmistakably intelligent in ways you can observe yourself just by spending time around them, and there is something undeniably eerie about an animal capable of holding a grudge against your face for over a decade and teaching its children to do the same. But the actual research, read carefully and without embellishment, is more impressive than the exaggerated version, not less. It describes a wild bird with a brain built on an entirely different architecture from ours, arriving independently at social memory, cooperative coordination, tool manufacture, apparent future planning, and detailed individualized tracking of the humans living around it. Scientists are only now building instruments sensitive enough and AI models powerful enough to start listening closely to how all of that gets communicated between one crow and the next. The honest scientific position today is this: crows almost certainly communicate more specific, structured information about their environment, including about individual humans, than researchers assumed even 10 years ago. Artificial intelligence is providing the first practical tools able to process the scale of data required to test that idea rigorously, rather than relying on scattered anecdotal observation. Some pieces of the puzzle, like elephant naming and dolphin signature whistles, have already been confirmed in other species, using exactly this kind of technology. The equivalent questions about crows, whether they use anything resembling names, whether their call sequences follow rule-governed syntax, are being actively investigated right now in Spain, with real recordings, real birds, and real uncertainty about what the final answer will be. Nobody has built a Crow-to-English dictionary. Nobody has decoded a Crow language. What has happened is the opening of a door that was, until very recently, simply too heavy for any human research team to push on alone. And on the other side of that door is a bird that has been paying far closer attention to us than we ever gave it credit for. The next time a crow watches you cross the street, sits quietly on a wire as you walk beneath it, or follows your movements a little longer than seems necessary, it is worth remembering what the science actually shows. That bird's brain, built on a blueprint completely different from yours, is running calculations about who you are and what you might do next, drawing on memories that may not even be its own, passed down from crows that encountered someone like you years before it hatched. We are only just beginning. To build the tools capable of listening in on how that information moves from one bird to the next, and what we are hearing so far suggests we have spent a very long time underestimating exactly who has been sharing the neighborhood with us. If this kind of deep dive into the science behind animal intelligence is something you want more of, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what comes out of this research next, and drop a comment letting us know which animal you would want scientists to decode next, because this is genuinely one of the fastest moving frontiers in biology right now, and we are going to keep following it as the real findings come in.